Dr. Terence Farrell is the principal of Farrell Law Mediation, which provides legal advice as well as mediation and arbitration services. He is also the principal consultant of Terriana Investments Limited, which provides business development and strategy consulting services. In 2008, he was appointed to the Board of Directors of Republic Bank Limited. He is also a director on the board of Eastern Caribbean Financial Holdings. Dr. Farrell is a former Deputy Governor of the Central Bank of Trinidad and Tobago. Within the private sector, he has held senior executive positions at Guardian Holdings Limited and One Caribbean Media Limited. He studied economics at the University of the West Indies and at the University of Toronto, where he obtained his PhD in 1979. He is a fellow of the Institute of Banking and Finance of Trinidad and Tobago. He has published several scholarly articles in economics, written a book on central banking in Trinidad and Tobago, and co-edited a book on Caribbean monetary integration. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Dr. Terence Farrell.
Our society is made up of morals and values. What do we mean by morals and values? Morals are also called principles. Morals are habits with respect to right or wrong conduct. Morality is ultimately a personal compass of right and wrong. Values are standards or ideals. Values are important and lasting beliefs shared by the members of a culture about what is good or bad and desirable or undesirable. Values have major influence on a person's behavior and attitude and serve as broad guidelines in all situations. One important result of morals and values is integrity. Without morals and values, there can be no integrity. The word integrity is much used in our society of late. That is understandable, because integrity is one of the main building blocks of a well-functioning democracy. Without integrity, corruption can take hold of a community. Corruption is defined by Transparency International as the abuse of entrusted power for private gain. The gain can be either financial or non-financial. In a worst-case scenario, extreme corruption could lead to poverty and could be the cause of hardship. An impoverished community can quickly turn chaotic and unstable. This scenario should make it clear that the fight against corruption is necessary. More importantly, every one of us, as citizens, must take responsibility for this fight. We should all be concerned about the spread of corruption, which can be compared to a virus capable of crippling government, discrediting public institutions and private corporations, as well as having a devastating impact on the human rights of populations.
I was asked to speak this morning about morality, integrity, and corruption in public life. What I want to talk a little bit about is, in terms of the agenda, is what corruption is, how we define it, how big the problem is, globally and regionally, how corruption occurs, what are some of its effects, both economic and social, what can be done about it, and then I want to talk a little bit about what I understand about the problems of governance and anti-corruption in Sint Maarten. So, what is corruption? What do we understand when we talk about corruption? Well, the dictionary definition of corruption is that it is a perversion or destruction of integrity in the discharge of public duties by bribery or favor. And it goes on, the use or existence of corrupt practices, especially in state, public corporations, etc. So I think that's the Oxford Dictionary definition of corruption. Transparency International has a rather very simple definition. It says corruption is the abuse of public and then interestingly, all private office for personal gain. So whereas the dictionary definition of the definition focuses on public, the Transparency International definition talks about both public office as well as private office. I think that's important because while a lot of the focus is on public corporation, public office, for the reason that we'll see, very often, in fact, in many instances, if I would address perhaps in most instances, you can't have corruption in public office unless somebody in the private sector is involved. So private sector people are the ones who may be doing the bribing, who are doing the corrupting, and corruption takes place in the private sector itself as between private sector people. And that is, I won't say it's just as bad, but it is nearly as bad as corruption in the public sector. So the addition of private office, I think, is extremely important, and we need to focus on that. The contemporary understanding of the issue, of course, goes beyond bribery, because traditionally, both legally and otherwise, it was defined really in terms of bribery. Somebody bribes somebody to do something. But the contemporary understanding now covers a whole range of things. It covers abuse of power. It covers conflict of interest. It covers patronage, nepotism, employing one's relatives and friends, theft of state assets. That could mean moving material from a public building site onto your own private property, as well as more sophisticated forms of stealing state assets. By the way, an interesting point about state assets is that, I don't know if that's the case here in Sint Maarten, I suspect it is, but governments don't have balance sheets as such. As in the private sector, I have a balance sheet, and I can identify what assets belong to me as a company. The state typically does not have an inventory, particularly when it comes to things like land and so on. The state does not have an inventory of all the land it owns. There are assets there's land in the state land, but there's no fence around it. Okay? So very often when people squat, for example, they squat on state land, and so somebody has to define what those assets are. And very often it's very easy for somebody to steal state assets simply because nobody's watching it. Nobody is accounting for it. Nobody may realize that it has gone missing for some time. The diversion of state resources, so diverting state resources to your own personal use. So for example, if you and it's not actually diverting an asset like material, but diverting men. So if I have state employees, public employees, and instead of having them work on a state public project, I have them build my house. Okay, that happens. So you're diverting state assets, you're diverting state resources for your own personal gain and use. Insider trading, so coming out of the private sector, insider trading, where information about what's happening in a particular company and so on, which may have implication for the share price, is told to somebody else. And you know there have been several insider trading scandals on Wall Street, throughout history actually. Illicit enrichment, a very interesting topic, which has been occupying my attention a little bit recently. Money laundering, which is a way, I'll talk a little bit more about that later on in the presentation, and providing advantage or preference. And this is extremely important in societies where there are various ethnic groups in the society, for example, and you may decide that you will give preference to somebody from your tribe. One of the things that we talk about corruption, we think about corruption, we go after the definition. The definition of corruption is that it is a perversion. It is something that is wrong or bad. It is something presumably that everybody recognizes to be wrong or bad. But let me point out to you that in certain societies, that last one there is not considered to be wrong or bad. In a place like Nigeria, for example, when one person gets into office, into government, there is an expectation that people from his family, his extended family, and his tribe will be favored. It's an expectation. And the society does not, at least historically, has not frowned on that. It's just simply that's the way it is. Right? One author, a Kenyan author, described it in a very interesting book. She's written, "It's our turn to eat." But corruption is it's a fairly complex concept in terms of what we understand about it, and therefore both literature, the United Nations, Transparency International, make distinctions about corruption. So that there is grand corruption, okay? And this grand corruption is situations where you're talking about at high levels of government which distort policy or the central functioning of the state, enabling leaders to benefit at the expense of the public good. Grand corruption. Petty corruption refers to the everyday abuse of entrusted power by low and mid-level public officials in their interaction with ordinary citizens who are often trying to get access to basic goods or services in places like hospitals, schools, police departments, and in other agencies. So for example, a policeman stops you on the road and wants to give you a ticket, and instead of giving you the ticket, you give him 10 euros. That is petty corruption. Okay? And it goes on all the time. It goes on in hospitals. And I was a very young, just came from out of secondary school, and my very first job was to work at Port Spain General Hospital in Trinidad. I was in the medical records department as a filing clerk, and that's what I was doing. And of course, for people to get care, you need to locate the record, which wasn't always very easy, the way they were filed. And I distinctly remember when I first experienced this as a young person and so on, this gentleman coming up to me, and in order for me to locate the record as quickly as I could, sticking a $5 note in my pocket. Right? I didn't ask for the $5 note. My salary then every month was, I think it was $160. So $5 was a lot of money. And he doesn't just stuck the $5 into my pocket. So when you have a situation like that, when you're entrusted to do a job, my job is to look for medical records, but his perception was that, well, if I give you my $5, it will hasten the process of locating a particular medical record. All that constitutes petty corruption. Gifts, for example. Public sector people may get gifts, particularly at Christmas time and so on. Somebody gives you 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 or a case of whiskey or champagne. What do you do with that? There are certain regimes where every gift you receive as a public official above a certain value must be declared and handed over. So you can't keep it. It belongs to the state. You can't keep it. Because below that value, then you presumably disclose it, but you may keep it. Free travel is a very important one. People get to go on trips and so on that are paid for by other people. And free access to clubs or club memberships and so on. All these things constitute what we call petty corruption. And then there is something called political corruption, which is the manipulation of policy. So for example, where private sector people want something, they want a license, they want a permission to do something. So they're actually trying to get the public official to change or to bend and so on policies that they're doing is a form of political corruption. And then we have things, for example, like transactional corruption and procurement corruption. We'll talk a little more about procurement corruption a little later on. So I'll take the contemporary understanding of corruption goes beyond the public sector official to include private sector persons, example, company directors. So in terms of understanding what corruption is, the common element is that the person is in a position of trust. Okay? And this is why in the case of the public sector, everybody who is in the public sector, why the focus on corruption is on the public sector. Because once you are a public official, you are in a position of trust. You are acting on behalf of someone. You are acting on behalf of the people actually. So you are in a position of trust. And so therefore persons in a position of trust have a duty. By virtue of being in a position of trust, you have a set of duties that correspond to that. And that duty is described as a fiduciary duty, and they have any or they call it the duty of care, a duty of confidentiality, that is to say you can't disclose people's business. You may be, by virtue of what you are doing in the public sector, you have access to confidential information. You have to recognize that the information that you have is confidential information and that you cannot disclose it to anybody else. So you have a duty of confidentiality. You have a duty of loyalty, that is to say loyalty to the state, loyalty to the people. And therefore you must avoid, therefore, conflicts of interest. Right? The duty of loyalty goes to the question of conflict of interest. So in terms of the ingredients of corruption, we have a position, so you must occupy a position. That position must be a position of trust. It must create a duty, and then in that context, we then look at your conduct. What do you do in those circumstances? And if that conduct of yours leads to harm, okay, then it has implications for the public, it may have implications for investors, it may have implications if you're a bank for depositors. So that's the nexus that we're talking about in terms of understanding corruption, the degrees of corruption. I must be in a position of trust that implies a certain set of duties, and if my conduct in that regard leads to certain harm, then that is corruption or potential corruption. So let's talk a little bit about the question of conduct and harm, because this is where sometimes the difficulty in these things lie. Right? And let's take, for example, a conflict of interest, which is a very common area of problems in the public sector. And a conflict of interest arises where the public official has a private interest, which is such as to influence or appear to influence the impartial and objective performance of his official duties. Now, to my knowledge, everybody has private interests. Everybody has private interests. Even when I get a job in the public sector, I have private interests. I have to get a salary every month, and I have things to do, and so on and so forth. And I'm in that job because I want the salary and all of that. So I do have private interests. So we come to the job with private interests. But the question is, when that interest appears to influence the impartial, and underline the words impartial and objective performance of your official duties. So if those duties that you're performing are not official, they're outside the scope of your position in the public sector, well then presumably that would not be considered to be a conflict of interest. So we're talking about your performance of your official duties in your official capacity, and if you fail to be impartial and objective, and so therefore you end up serving your private interest. Private interest may not necessarily mean your personal interest. It may mean the interest of your wife, your child, your friend, your cousin, your sister, your tribe that you belong to. Those are your private interests. In other words, it's not public interest. Then you have a conflict of interest. So family, close friends, persons and organizations whom you have some kind of relationship with. And it may also involve any liability, whether financial, civil, relating thereto. And that's the definition coming from the Council of Europe on their model code of conduct for public officials. And so therefore the kinds of conflicts that we may have would be self-dealing, doing something that benefits me directly, influence peddling. Somebody comes to you and they have your ear so that you can get the minister to do some particular thing that they want to get done. The use of state property we talked about, accepting benefits, using confidential information, and outside employment. Outside employment is very interesting because sometimes people who are working in the public sector do moonlighting. Okay? They do have some other job taking place elsewhere, which is presumably against the rules that we have in the public sector. Now, the other question about conflict and harm is about the problem of harm. The harm which may result from corrupt conduct includes a higher cost to taxpayers for goods and services, higher prices to consumers, the deprivation of goods and services which are diverted elsewhere, and also threats and psychological pressure that may be put on. But one of the problems that we have with harm as far as public officials are concerned is that sometimes it is very difficult to see what the harm is. Very difficult to see what the harm is remote. The person who is engaged in the corrupt practice does not see the effect that his action is having on the public. Doesn't see what the impact is on taxpayers, for example. So that remoteness is important because we're talking about, in this presentation, we're talking about morality. And so one of the issues that we have about morality as distinct from questions of ethics and so on. Morality goes to what impacts your personal conscience. Right? And that's the distinction I try to make. When I talk about ethics and morality and so on to people, I make the distinction between ethics and morality being something which impacts your personal or your individual conscience. And one of the problems that we have with issues about morality, a public official who is engaged in a corrupt practice, one of the things that people use for what is called self-justification, right? In other words, you know that you've done something wrong. You understand that you've done something wrong, but you end up justifying it to yourself because you can't identify the harm that you've caused. Okay. If I grab your handbag, or if I go into your company and I embezzle money from your safe, then I clear in my mind that I have stolen money from you. But if I steal money from the state and I can't see the impact of that on anybody, then what happens is that people justify that to themselves because they can't identify a particular person that they have harmed. And that process of self-justification, which people who have, the moral philosophers and so on, who have wrestled with this issue and so on, have pointed out that that is a very important part of the whole process of people justifying unethical and immoral conduct. They can't identify or they refuse to see the people who are being harmed by their action. And this is true in the public sector, because in the public sector, a lot of the things that we do in the public sector, it is the taxpayers. Who is the taxpayer? It's not a particular individual that we can see and feel and touch, and therefore it fails to impact on the consciences of those individuals. One of the other issues that we need to talk about when we talk about justification of corrupt conduct is that people, in justifying to themselves why they have done something, they say, well, they pay too low. Well, it's your smile, because it's true. In the public service, public civil, generally speaking, they're paid lower than the private sector. Except, by the way, in Singapore. Right? In Singapore, the public servants are paid much better than the private sector. Much, much better. And as we'll see a little bit later on, Singapore is one of the countries in the world which has one of the lowest incidences of corruption. Not only for that reason, right? We'll see some other reasons why Singapore has very low corruption. But in Singapore, public servants are paid very well compared to the private sector. Generally speaking, in other countries, public servants tend to be paid rather less well. And so part of their self-justification for engaging in corrupt practices is that, well, we don't get paid enough. So as a policeman, well, why do you allow the quarry operator to drive, to do illegal quarrying and take all the material straight past you for the bribes because they're not being paid? So that's the scale of the problem. Corruption is estimated to cost about 5% of global GDP, or $2.6 trillion. Now, to understand $1 trillion, because $1 trillion is 1,000 billion dollars. And this is US dollars. So it's $2.6 trillion is estimated to cost in terms of global GDP. The World Bank and the United Nations STAR initiative stands for Stolen Asset Recovery Initiative, estimated that criminal activities, corruption, and tax evasion account for $1 to $1.6 trillion every year. It's organized crime, plus corruption, plus tax evasion account for between $1 and $1.6 trillion every year. STARS also estimated that developing countries lose $20 to $40 billion every year due to corruption. These are developing countries. These are countries where the poor people in the world are located are losing $20 to $40 billion every year to corruption. And the World Economic Forum estimates that the cost of corruption, corruption increases the cost of doing business by 10%. So this is the Transparency International global chart. And the countries that are red are the ones that are where the corruption perception index is the worst. Okay? So you see Africa is all red, except South Africa looks a little more orange. Right through Russia, all the way up to India. India is one of the more corrupt places. So the new Prime Minister of India, Mr. Modi, and so on, is under pressure to deal with corruption in India. China, look at China. And of course, you see those that are more yellow, orange, yellow, coming down to white, where corruption is lowest. So that Canada, the United States, Australia, Sweden, and Norway. The Netherlands, of which you are a part, is also very low. Right? Generally speaking, Europe, Western Europe tends to be very low. Now, of course, on that map, you can't see the Caribbean because we are very small. So I just picked out some countries from that list. So you can see that Norway, for example, ranks number 5 in the world, very, very low corruption, and their score is 86. The higher score, the less corruption you have. Singapore is at 7, the score 84. The Netherlands, which you are a part, is also very so this is very admirable. The United States and the United Kingdom are in the second 10, and then Barbados is also very, very high up. And then you come down to the countries like Jamaica and Trinidad. We are both tied down at the bottom half of the table with Guyana, and then Nigeria is way down. And this is about 176 or 175 countries. So, you know, and it's very simple to look at this on the Transparency International website.